There we go. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jack Martin. I'm a reference librarian here at the Patent Free Library, filling in the history room during our search for our new archivist. As I'm sure many of you already know, Mary Kate Kwasnick, our previous archivist, left at the end of February. We were very sorry to see her go, but thankful for the 2 years of incredible work she did here at Patent Free and wish her all the best in her next venture. Tonight's program is part of our History Room Live series, where we aim to bring you presentations, lectures, and workshops that explore the rich histories of our member communities and the state of Maine beyond. This is a hybrid program, so a quick note for our Zoom listeners, of whom I think there are even more than normal tonight because of the weather. The Zoom component is being run as a webinar, so you will not be able to turn on your cameras or unmute yourselves. The chat feature is available if you encounter any technical difficulties, and I'll be monitoring it throughout the program. So if you run into an issue, just shoot me a message there and I'll hopefully get it sorted out for you. We also invite you to join the Q&A at the end of the program. You can submit any questions you have for our speaker using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And any listeners requiring closed captioning can click the C icon at the bottom of their screens as well, and Zoom will auto-generate them. They're not perfect, but they're pretty okay. And then joining us tonight is Seth Goldstein, who I will allow to introduce himself, just to make sure I don't mess anything up. Thank you so much, Seth. Already.
Thank you, Jack. Hi there, my name is Seth Goldstein. I'm a maritime historian. I grew up on Cape Cod, and that's where I developed my love of maritime history. So my dad was a high school librarian, and he would bring home books for me about local Cape Cod shipwrecks. And so the joke here is that I must have been a weird kid because I was fascinated at a young age by some of the shipwreck books that he would bring home. And as many of you are probably aware, Cape Cod juts out into the Atlantic Ocean. I'll use my arm here, Cape Cod. And so if a storm came up and a historic sailing vessel is, sailing from, say, New York to Boston before the Cape Cod Canal was built in the 1930s, very often all the captain could do is throw out the anchors and pray, and often those prayers were not enough, and the ships would wreck on what we call the backside of Cape Cod. But I still remember to this day, one of these wrecks was a boat carrying a cargo of jute in the late 1800s, comes up against the backside of the Cape in a winter storm, maybe not unlike the winter storm that we're about to experience. And so the sailors climbed up into the rigging of this historic sailing vessel to escape the icy cold sea spray. Well, that's where they were found in the morning, entombed in ice, frozen to death, still clinging to the rigging. Now, I thought that was very interesting. And so, like I said, I must have been a weird kid. I was that kid in the back of the library where I grew up in Brewster. We had the Brewster Ladies Library on Cape Cod. I was that kid in the back of the library on rainy days poring over the Time Life series about World War II or looking at books about the Civil War. And I've always just been transfixed by history and maritime history in particular. I study a variety of maritime historical topics, the historic North Atlantic fishery, the lobster industry, the life-saving service, lighthouses, the Middle Passage, which was, of course, was the voyage that the enslaved Africans were forced to endure on their way to the Western Hemisphere. And in the last couple of years, my research has been what I look forward to sharing with you this evening, the West Indies trade. This was Maine's economic relationship with the luxury-producing plantations of the West Indies, and I'll share much more about that with you in just a moment. I have taught at the University of New England and Southern Maine Community College, and most recently at the Maine College of Art and Design, where I taught a couple of semesters of a course I designed on the topic of global piracy. It's another thing that I've been fascinated by because they discovered the pirate ship Witta off of the coast of Cape Cod when I was a kid in 1985. So I taught a class on global piracy to the art school students at the Maine College of Art and Design, and not surprising, right? 20-year-old art school students thought pirates were really cool. Yeah. And I was able to kind of trick them into learning some history that way, which was fun. So, yeah, Maine College of Art and Design. I have worked for the Portland Harbor Museum, Greater Portland Landmarks, and today, as you can see on my slide, I am the Director of Development for the South Portland Historical Society, and I direct our Cushing's Point Museum at lovely Bug Light Park. So two different but related positions. I spend the summer managing our museum, so we'll be opening on May 1st. And just so, you know, if you happen to find yourself in South Portland, we have a lovely new exhibit that I'm curating on tools and industry in South Portland. We have a lovely collection of tools that have never been displayed before. Some of them from the shipbuilding industry, some from the ice industry, and some from the lumber industry. And so I'm looking forward to curating that exhibit. That's what I'll be working on the next couple of weeks in anticipation of opening the museum on the 1st of May. And we're open through October. So as I said, if you find yourself in South Portland, come say hi to me. I'll be there all summer. I also do our development work, which means I do our fundraising, and a lot of our money goes to pay my salary. So I spend a lot of time raising my own salary, which reminds me, Jack, I'll be needing that check after the lecture. Wonderful. I'd like to start this lecture with a quote from William Hutchinson Rowe's Maritime History of Maine, which he published in 1948. William Hutchinson Rowe, Maritime History of Maine, has a chapter in it, chapter 6. The title of that chapter is The West India Trade, chapter 6. And I have a quote here. Regardless of what was to be a Maine's boy occupation or profession, an indispensable part of his upbringing was a voyage or two in the West India trade. And so what he's saying here, William Hutchinson Rowe, is that it was very common historically for a young man in Maine to take at least one or two voyages to the West Indies, regardless of what he was going to occupationally do when he was a little bit older, whether he was to be a lawyer or a apothecary or a cooper. They would take one or two of these voyages as very young men, maybe late teens, early 20s, to the West Indies, and this would have been an opportunity for them to, you know, see some of the world, perhaps sow their royal oats. So interesting. And then the author goes on in this chapter 6 about the West India trade to discuss kind of all of the commodities that are produced in Maine and then shipped down to the West Indies, and conversely, what was shipped as return cargoes back here to Maine from the West Indies. Now, in this entire chapter devoted to the West India trade, the author does not once mention enslaved Africans, right? And you think about that, it's the enslaved Africans who are producing these luxury commodities that are being sold here in Maine and making a lot of people rich. Not one mention of these individuals in the whole chapter. And so it got me thinking, this is kind of a metaphor for how we treat our maritime history in you know, Portland and Bath and Maine and New England. We put this maritime history up on a pedestal, right? I think about the Maine Mariners, our amateur hockey team, right, are named Mariners, or the fact that the Portland High School has a clipper ship as their iconography, or the fact that the City Hall in Portland has a caravel on its weather vane, right? You know, all these different kind of schools and mascots and sports teams with these maritime history related names and iconography. So we put this maritime history up on a pedestal, but we have failed until recently to ask difficult questions, uncomfortable questions, you know, about where were these ships from Maine sailing to, these celebrated ships? What was the trade that they were involved in? What commodities were they sailing with? And what commodities did they return to Maine with? And so this research, which I've been conducting over the last couple of years, is an effort to answer that question and to more accurately examine Maine's and New England's maritime history, to take this history out of the realm of nostalgia. Like a lot of people, you know, have a nostalgia for things, but that's not necessarily an accurate representation of what took place historically. And so that's what I will attempt to share with you this evening. So take a look here This is exports and returns, New England trade 1650, so very early in the colonial period. And if we look at the arrows that connect New England to, you can see Barbados there in the West Indies. One of our initial trade partners in the West Indies is Barbados, and there'll actually be chronology of who we trade with. We trade with, Barbados initially. Later on, the French islands, think Martinique. Haiti was a really big trade partner before the Haitian Revolution takes place. And then once we get to the 1800s, Cuba will become Maine's primary trade partner, particularly Portland. So what we see here, though, is we look at what's going from New England to Barbados. We can see here red oak staves, lumber, and fish. And so many of you out there probably know a stave is a part of a cask. And just really nerdy stuff. We say barrels. Well, a barrel is in fact the size of cask. A tierce is the size of cask. A hogshead is a size of cask. A barrel is really a size of cask. But they would take these red oak staves, basically were barrels or casks that were broken down to save space and then shipped to the West Indies, where they would be assembled and filled with molasses, sugar, or rum. So that's what's going on there. Molasses, sugar, and rum are coming up from Barbados to New England. So you have the staves, the lumber, and the fish, and the molasses, sugar, and rum as return cargoes. And once again, this is 1650, so very early in the colonial period. Here you see another map, and this is from the National Park Service. And what this shows you is the Middle Passage. And if you take a look closer to the Western Hemisphere, what you'll see is another red arrow that also has enslaved Africans, in addition to raw materials, coming up from the West Indies to New England. And this is what historians today call the Second Middle Passage. So very few enslaved Africans come directly from Africa to New England. They largely came through this Second Middle Passage after a stop, could be a stop of several years in the West Indies. And this is how merchants would purchase their enslaved Africans and how enslaved Africans wound up here in New England. You would have a merchant who would sail to the West Indies, perhaps with a cargo of salt cod and lumber. They would buy some molasses, some sugar, perhaps some rum. And while they were there, they would purchase a few enslaved Africans. Once again, this is known as the Second Middle Passage. Now, the museum that I direct is called the Cushing's Point Museum, and it's named after a point of land that is named after a gentleman named Colonel Ezekiel Cushing. And Cushing was one of the first individuals involved in this West Indies trade. And he likely purchased his enslaved Africans as part of his involvement in this aforementioned trade. We know the names of his enslaved Africans because we have a copy of his will at the South Portland Historical Society. And we know that he left Cato and Phyllis to his son Thomas in his will, and he left a 4-year-old girl named Dinah to his wife Mary. And so, this is really exceptional information. I should mention, many times in the historical record, you just see individuals labeled as Negro servants, and they use that word servant as opposed to slave, and there's a reason for that I won't get into right now. So the fact that we know the names of these enslaved individuals, and in the case of Dinah, the little girl that we know her age, this is really exceptional information. These individuals who came, these enslaved individuals who came on the Second Middle Passage, the term that they used for them in this colonial period is they were referred to as seasoned, like a piece of wood has been seasoned. And what this meant about these people was that they had spent some time in the West Indies. They had some knowledge of the English language and some knowledge of European cultural norms. And so they were referred to as seasoned. They were hence preferred to enslaved Africans that came directly from Africa because of that knowledge.
Will.
Let's see, the question is, what's the date of the will? Let's see, Colonel Ezekiel Cushing dies in the late 1700s. The date of the will, I'm not sure exactly, but I would say, educated guess, sometime between 1750 and 1770. So here you can see, once again, kind of early in the colonial period, Nathaniel Knight's ledger from 1734. Knight was the nephew and right-hand man of Colonel Thomas Westbrook, whom the town of Westbrook is named after, who served as the masked agent to the crown with his partner Samuel Waldo, whom Waldoboro is named after. And this was before Captain Tate comes, because the oldest building in Portland is the Tate House that was built for senior masked agent Tate. So, but before he was the masked agent, this guy, Colonel Westbrook, was the senior masked agent. And so I want to thank my friend Matt Anson for taking this picture for me over at the Maine Historical Society in Portland. And if you take a look at the arrows here, I want to point out these luxury commodities and their significance in the colonial period during the mass trade. And so what this is a ledger of things that were sold to workers working in the mass trade. So think of it as like kind of the company store. This is what folks are buying from the company store. And you can see already in the early 1700s, the importance of these luxury commodities. So we take a look at that first arrow there, sugar and cotton, right? There's some creative spellings in here. We have to use our imagination a little bit. The second one, sugar. The third arrow down, we see tobacco, another luxury commodity. Sugar below that, and below that, once again, tobacco, and that may be molasses in front of it. So once again, early in the colonial period, these luxury commodities are already indispensable to people's livelihoods here in Maine. And now I'd like to share with you a little bit about the production of sugar. This is where we were getting these luxury commodities from. Sugar plantations are considered to be the first industrial production centers, combines both aspects of agricultural and factory work. And so this is a quote from Sweetness and Power by an author named Sidney Mintz. It was basically one of the first histories that examines one commodity and its important place in history. I think he wrote this book in the 1970s, Sweetness and Power. Since then, there have been many books written about specific commodities and their importance in global history. But Mintz says, and I quote, without boiling and skimming and reducing juice, there is no way to make granular sugar. It cannot be done without solid technical mastery, particularly in the control of heat. Just as a factory and field worker are wedded in sugar making, brute field labor and skilled artisanal knowledge are both necessary. And so you can see here in the picture on the upper left, that's a sugar press. And what they're doing is the enslaved Africans are feeding the sugar cane into these rollers that are operated and powered by oxen. And what that does is produces a sugar juice that is then boiled down. And what you get from that process, you get granulated sugar. And as a byproduct, you get molasses. Molasses is a byproduct of the sugar making process. It is a sweet liquid that can't be processed any further into granulated sugar and becomes very important in of itself as a trade commodity. You can see field workers on the lower left, and then on the lower right, once again, a sugar press that they would feed the cane into. Work in the mill and boiling house, unpleasant and dangerous. Work was exhausting and led to horrific accidents. And this had to be done quickly. The sugar cane will start to ferment if it's not processed quickly. It had to be done and harvested at a certain time of year. And then once it was harvested, it had to be process quickly, or it would begin to ferment and they would lose the product. So a lot of pressure to get this stuff processed. So exhausting, horrific accidents. For example, a slave with a machete stood beside the slave who fed the cane into the mill, ready to cut off the arm of the mill feeder in case it became trapped. Sir Thomas Lynch wrote in 1672, quote, plantations are subject to abundance of ill accidents, especially sugar works, because they have so many machines. A contemporary writer records some of the hazards, and you can see that below there. If a mill feeder be catched by the finger, his whole body is drawn in and is squeezed to pieces. If a boiler gets any part into the scalding sugar, it sticks like glue or birdlime, and 'tis hard to save either limb or life. And so here you can see, this is in the Maine Historical Society collection, painting of a sugarcane harvest and transport in Cuba in 1873. It's very, idealized, bucolic kind of scene, but keep in mind that the institution of African enslavement on the island of Cuba is legal until 1886. So what we're seeing here is, in fact, enslaved Africans harvesting and transporting this sugar. Now, this is quite horrific information. The average lifespan of an enslaved African on the island of Cuba, should they survive the Middle Passage. And bear in mind that about a fifth of these enslaved individuals didn't survive the Middle Passage, but should you survive the Middle Passage, your life expectancy on the island of Cuba was just 7 years, because these individuals were literally worked to death. What happened was the plantation owners realized it was cheaper to bring in new enslaved Africans from Africa than it was to properly feed and take care of these individuals, and hence they were worked to death. And this painting is by Portland artist William Chadwick, who lived in Matanzas, Cuba from 1870 to 1876, and he went down there to paint, beautiful bucolic scenes. His family owned shipping involved with the transport of molasses from Cuba and Guadeloupe. And so, you'll come to find out over the course of the lecture, there was a really significant relationship between Portland and the island of Cuba. This is just one of the many examples. There's a letter in the possession of the Maine Historical Society to Portland resident Elizabeth Montfort. It's a friend traveling in Trinidad, Cuba. And I'd like to thank Linda Ashford for her photograph of Trinidad, Cuba. Linda was there in the before times, before the pandemic, and took this photograph, and I use it with her permission. And so from the letter there on the left, there's a quote, and says, "Dear Elizabeth, I should like to spend some time in the country, were it not for the shrieks of the slaves, which you hear constantly, someone or another being nearly all the time at the whipping post." And so here you can see a map of Portland in the colonial period. Very interestingly, they produce rum in Portland. So you can see Preble, Isley, two Isley brothers, not the Isley brothers, but two other Isley brothers, Simon Mayo, John Waite, 5 of the foremost merchants in Falmouth, invested in the construction of a large distillery on its own wharf at the far northeastern end of 4th Street. In spite of local interference due to alcohol-related criminality, this operation overseen by Daniel Isley was producing enough rum by 1774, so right before the American Revolution, to meet substantial regional demand. To be sure, Fiddle Lane, which is now better known as the Franklin Arterial in Portland, laid out in 1756, became infamous for its watering holes frequented by laborers and sailors on shore leave in their brief periods of leisure. And that quote is from Portland as Commercial Center, an essay written in a wonderful book called Creating Portland. It was a series of scholarly essays on a variety of topics related to Portland history. So I thought this was kind of interesting. When I first moved up here to Portland about 15 years ago, I first moved up to Maine. I went to the Packy. and I saw a bottle of Screech rum made in Newfoundland, and I thought, well, that's weird. I traveled around the Caribbean and South America, and I thought that rum was all, produced there. Are they producing rum in Newfoundland, right? Well, so much molasses coming up to the Canadian Maritimes and to Maine and other parts of New England that they're producing rum here. And what my history research reflects is that the rum produced in the Caribbean was more expensive, was considered a more premium product than the locally produced rum. So probably if you're a rich merchant, you're drinking the good stuff that's coming up from the West Indies. If you were maybe an Irish immigrant working on the Grand Trunk Railroad or on the docks, you probably drank locally produced rum. So in 1787, listen to this, 1787, 73 of the 89 ships that departed from Portland Harbor were bound for the West Indies, right? 73 out of the 89 ships that left Portland were headed to the West Indies. Gives you an indication of how important this trade is. Especially, this is in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Now, following the repeal of the 1824 molasses tax, it becomes cheaper to produce rum in Portland than to import it from the West Indies. Hence, Portland had seven rum distilleries along its waterfront in the early 19th century. Some of the rum that's produced in Portland goes to purchase enslaved Africans in Africa, thereby completing this circuit of the Atlantic world economy. I have a quote here. This is from David Carey Jr., his essay, Comunidad Escondida, Latin American Influence in 19th and 20th Century Portland, once again published in Creating Portland. And Carey says, quote, for much of the 19th century, Portland was a major entrepot of international commerce. Entrepot, for those of you who maybe don't know, it's just a fancy word that historians use for a port or a location where goods are shipped to and stored and transshipped. So you could say, like, they use the term entrepot sometimes with the term hinterland. So hinterland maybe being the interior, entrepot, commercial center. So Portland, a major entrepot of international commerce. At a time when Cuba was the United States' third largest trading partner, Portland was one of its major ports in this exchange, and Maine ships were among the most common vessels trafficking in the West Indies. Ships loaded with lumber, bricks, and ice set sail for the Caribbean islands and returned with sugar, molasses, and rum and goods to stock local grocery stores. And historically, grocery stores, if they had goods from the West Indies, they would have a sign in the window that said WI goods, West Indies goods. And these were primarily spices, in addition to some other things. But you would have individual sailors who would have what they called a venture, right? They would buy something in the West Indies and make a little profit. They would often buy a crate of exotic fruits, like pineapples, something of that nature, that they would buy of their own account and then bring up here to sell in New England. Carey goes on to say that the wealth generated in this trade affected Portland's physical environment, from landfill extended wharfs to large homes that remain central to Portland's identity today. The Portland bricks that dot the streets of Trinidad, Cuba, are symbolic of the intricate relations between Portland and Latin America. And guess what, folks? Those Portland bricks still line the streets of Trinidad, Cuba today. They would have been used as ballast in the ships headed down there. The streets of Trinidad, Cuba today still lined with Maine bricks, a testament to this close economic relationship. So here you see what I think was the largest building on the Portland waterfront in the 19th century. This was John Bundy's Brown's sugar refinery. Portland imported 3 times as much molasses as Boston, and the Portland Sugar Works was processing 200 hogshead, it's the size of cask, a 63-gallon cask, of molasses a day. By 1855, it's employing 150 to 200 workers. 10 years later, right before the Great Fire of 1866 burns most of Portland to the ground, it employs 1,000 individuals. And apparently, the sugar refinery burned spectacularly for days during the Great Fire of 1866, you might be aware that sugar is very flammable. Almost 1,000 individuals working there, many of them recently arrived Irish immigrants who were living in the Gorham Corner neighborhood adjacent to the sugar refinery. They were fleeing the various potato famines in Ireland, and they became sugar boilers. About this time, 1860, 20% of all of the molasses in the United States processed in Portland, more than any other city in the United States. And so what J.B. Brown does is he figures out using steam, it's this proprietary method of extracting granulated sugar from molasses. As I had said towards the beginning of the lecture, molasses is a byproduct of the sugar making process. He figures out how to get granulated white sugar out of the molasses. And so he kind of pioneers that effort, makes a lot of money doing it. 7-story tall building on the Portland waterfront, employing 1,000 individuals. Here's a great quote. Without molasses, no lumberman could be happy in the unsweetened wilderness. Pork lubricates the joints. Molasses gives tenacity to the muscles. And so, one of the things that I really enjoy is food. I like to eat it. I like to prepare it. I like to eat food by other people prepared for me. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is the intersection of my two passions, history and food. And, this is fun to share with young college students that, refrigerators haven't been around for forever. Hard for them to believe, young people, they can't imagine a time before their iPhones, right? But refrigeration, as you know, relatively new advent, only been around for, about 100 years. Before that, all of your food had to be preserved. It had to be pickled or salted or in some way cured, and hence it probably tasted pretty gross. And so you would want to sweeten your food with molasses. And so molasses, very popular commodity on the farms and the lumber camps in the hinterland of Maine. Also, any sort of working class person, urban or rural, would have used a lot of molasses. But if you're rich, if you were well-to-do, if you were a person of substance, if you made a lot of money, if perhaps you were a merchant, you would have granulated white sugar. And it came in a cone like this, would be packed into a sugar mold. You can find these sugar molds sometimes still at antique shops. And then they would nip off a bit of sugar with the sugar nips that you see on the left there. And this was how people knew you were fancy pants. You would offer them granulated white sugar with their tea if they came over. Think about that for a second. Now you have a luxury commodity from the West Indies that you're combining with a luxury commodity from the Far East. But what a lot of people in Portland had was these ornate sugar bowls. You can see one of the sugar bowls at the top of the screen there. And you would have this ornate sugar bowl on your dining room table so you could offer your guests sugar when they came to visit. And so also that people would know that you were a fancy pants. I recently did some work with the Portland Museum of Art, and they wanted to recontextualize some of the art in their collection. I was part of an advisory group, excellent advisory group, and they were very curious, the curatorial staff at the Portland Museum of Art, about some of my research. And I told them, this information about sugar bowls. So they were curious. They went into their collection. They found 70 beautiful glass ornate sugar bowls. 70. This is just the Portland Museum of Art. I bet Maine Historic probably has another 70, right? But it's a testament, right, to these, these were really important. And J.B. Brown, in fact, had a glass factory adjacent to his sugar refinery so he could produce these beautiful glass vessels. So if you go to the PMA today, they have reinterpreted their American art gallery, and they have on a table about 20 of these ones are all glass, sugar bowls, and they're on a table and you can walk around them. And there's contextual information there about this trade. Now here's the man himself. Here's John Bundy Brown. Began his Portland, Maine career earning $50 a year at the Alpha Shaw's grocery store on Middle Street. He began experimenting with sugar production. One of his workers, Dependence H. Furbish, invented a method using steam to produce high quality granulated sugar from molasses. In 1855, Brown forms the Portland Sugar House. Sugar refinery, as I said, burns during the Great Fire of '66. Brown rebuilds, but the sugar business never regains its national prominence. He also invests in railroads, banking, and real estate, becomes Portland's largest landholder, in fact. Now, once again, he's producing all of this money from the refining of sugar that is grown by enslaved Africans in the West Indies. This is 1858, completed his palatial mansion, which he calls Bromhill, that he builds on the Western Promenade in Portland. They tear it down, I think, in the 19 teens, but he sells off the other plots of land to his other rich merchant buddies. And so if you go to the Western Prom in Portland today, or the Eastern Promenade, you'll see a lot of these beautiful mansions done in a variety of styles of architecture, many of them built from funds generated in this West Indies trade, many of them in sugar or sugar refining or the transport of molasses and or sugar and rum, and a variety of related occupations. So Brown also becomes a major patron of the arts in Portland. His large collection of American and European art donated to the Portland Museum of Art after his death in 1881. Bromhill, as I said, demolished in 1915. But the beginning of the art collection at the PMA, the Portland Museum of Art, is actually Brown's private art collection that he donates later on. This is the J.B. Brown building on Congress Street in Portland, built by his sons, Philip Henry and John Marshall, 1882 and 1883, to honor their father once he passes away. In fact, this building right across from the Maine College of Art and Design, and it has J.B. Brown's signature in the brownstone above the door. And now this is a company still involved in commercial real estate in the city of Portland today. In fact, in 2020, this company, Brown's descendants, developed a 51 residential units and a retail space on Free Street in Portland. Their very own website describes the company as still family owned. So marinate on that for a second, right? The wealth that this family generated off of the backs of enslaved Africans in Cuba in the 1800s is still helping this family to purchase commercial real estate in Portland today. It's a real testament to the power of generational wealth. Here you see this is the Safford House, 93 High Street in Portland. This was, up until recently, the home of Greater Portland Landmarks, a historic preservation organization in the city, built by merchant William Safford in 1858. He makes much of his money through the importation of molasses from Cuba. Safford had an office in Cardensis, Cuba, where he frequently journeyed to conduct his business. In fact, he's there so often that his daughter Inez is born in Cardensis in 1848. And so a lot of these merchants in Portland had what today we would call integrated means of production. That is to say, they owned the shipping, they owned the plantations in Cuba, they owned the enslaved Africans, and then they owned the means to refine that molasses into either rum or sugar once it was shipped to Portland. And I know it's a little out of focus, but here is a list that I got from the Cape Elizabeth Historical Society of imports to Portland in 1847. And so you can see what type of ship it is on the left, the name of the master, a quantity and what the cargo was, the consignee, and where from. So this is really interesting. What you see here is molasses, a little bit of salt, molasses, a little bit of sugar, boxes of sugar. And so these are the consignees. Second one down, J.B. Brown, the proprietor of the sugar refinery. A little bit further down, J.B. Brown again, J.B. Brown and Co., and a variety of other well-to-do Portland merchants. Now look at where these vessels are coming from, almost exclusively from Cuba. Cardensis, Matanzas, Havana, Matanzas, Cardenza, Bonaire, Cardenza, Matanzas, Some of them from Trinidad, Cuba, not Trinidad, the island. So, the vast majority of vessels coming into Portland in 1847, coming with molasses um, from Cuban ports for to be refined in Portland into refined white sugar. This is Willard Beach, where I take my kids in the summer. Now that I'll take them this summer if any of Willard Beach remains after this latest storm. This is you can see the historic fishing shacks that we lost on January 13th. There were two of the historic fishing shacks remained. They were swept away. There are efforts to have them rebuilt. We'll see what happens there. But a history of Portland, William Willis, 1831, states, I quote, as early as 1745, there were owned at that precinct in Cape Elizabeth, today South Portland, 5 schooners and 5 sloops, and a subsequent period, the West India business was carried out there to a considerable extent, principally by William Symington, and that area is still today known as Symington Cove, and the aforementioned Ezekiel Cushing, who I told you about earlier, who owned the enslaved Africans. So these are considered to be some of the first people involved in this West Indies trade. Mr. Symington had a large and valuable wharf in the cove, which still bears his name. Were not only his own, but other vessels were found pursuing a profitable traffic, says William Willis in 1831. And guess what? If you walk out there during low tide to the point right where those fishing shacks are, you can still see the remains of Symington's wharf. It was stone and crib work, wooden beams. So, I go over there to look for, snails and hermit crabs with my kids during low tide. And the remains of that wharf are still there to be seen when the tide is quite low. Many ships built in Maine shipyards for the West India trade, typically fore and aft rigged, allowing them to sail to a greater degree into the wind. Square rigged vessels were built more for transoceanic voyages to sail in front of the wind. The most common rigging configuration employed in the West India trade was a topsail schooner, like the one you see in this painting here. In the 18th century, ships would be built, outfitted, and provisioned in Portland Harbor, then packed with trade goods. Then the vessels, with all of their contents, would be sold in the British West Indies. So that they would sell the boat, they would sell all the cargo in the British West Indies. I guess the sailors would have to hitch a ride back here to Maine. In the late colonial period, Portland, which at the time was called Falmouth, had 2 large shipyards and many other small yards producing cargo vessels from 100 to 1,000 tons of carrying capacity. Shipwrights used wood from oak, maple, birch, chestnut, beech, elm, and fir trees. Maine also built many small boats that were shipped to the West Indies for a variety of uses. The best known of these type of crafts were flat-bottom boats known as Moses boats. These Moses boats were used to transport molasses from the plantations to larger ships. So today we would call them lighters, right? Like a small boat that takes, the big boat can't get right up to the plantation because the water is too shallow. They would use these Moses boats that were produced here in Maine to lighter the molasses or sugar or rum out to the larger vessels. Just point of interest, the famous privateer Dash was originally rigged in this fashion for the West Indies trade. And the Dash is quite famous in the Portland area. She was a privateer in the War of 1812, captured a large quantity of rum off of the Canadian Maritimes, and Old Dart rum was famous in Portland for many years. In fact, so many people claim to have had Old Dart rum that there's no possible way that it all came from the Dart, from the Dash. But she was rigged in this way for the West Indies trade initially. Now here you see a codfish. This is another, fascinating commodity. I told you earlier in the lecture, there was a book, Sweetness and Power, about sugar and its important role in world history. Well, maybe some of you out there have heard of Mark Kurlansky's book, Cod, the biography of the fish that changed the world. The reason why the codfish is so important is that it takes the salting process better than any other protein known to man. And once again, you know, before refrigeration, all your food had to be cured or smoked or pickled or in some way preserved. It just happens that the cod flesh is very lean. And it turns out that fat is the enemy of preservation. So being a very lean flesh, the codfish takes the salting process better than any other protein known to man. And so maybe some of you have seen salt cod. You know, you can still get it at the fish market. It's pretty expensive today. Historically, the cheapest protein available to man. But, you know, it becomes incredibly hard once it's been cured. And what they would do is they would salt it, and then it would be left out in the sun to cure for about a week. And once it had finished curing, it was very hard. It could be shipped. You know, I could hit the salt cod up against the wall without any fear of damaging the salt cod. But interestingly enough, you get that salt cod and you rehydrate it in some water, and it regains this flaky texture of codfish. And, you know, I tell my college students, oh, people used to do this in the top tanks of their toilets. And the college kids say, ooh, gross. No, 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 silly. It's not the poo water, right? These are the tanks of the toilets, when toilets used to have tanks on the top of them. And every time you flush the toilet, it would change that water and desalinate it, right? So you take that salt cod, you put it in water, you desalinate it, and it becomes codfish again. This is why, you know, some of you may be aware that salt cod is still an important ingredient in food in the Caribbean today, as it is still an important ingredient here in New England. However, today, very, very expensive, historically very cheap. 4 grades of salt cod, depending on how well it cured, how well it took the curing process. And, you know, some of this would be what type of salt you would use, right? Turns out there are many different types of salt. Some salts would actually burn cod flesh. You wouldn't use them for this purpose. And so, interestingly enough, Mark Kurlansky, who wrote Cod, a biography of the fish that changed the world, his next book was about salt. So kind of companion books. But 4 grades of salt cod, historically merchantable, the best quality fish based on texture and color. Madeira, almost as high quality as merchantable, shipped to Europe. And what this salt cod was used for, the stuff that was shipped to Europe, was to feed Catholics on meatless Fridays. So you think about your Catholic countries along the Mediterranean, Portugal, Spain, France, Italy. So a lot of salt, and still today, salt cod, you know, they call it bacala, right, in the Iberian Peninsula. Very important food there still. Lesser quality fish was known as West India fish, salt cod that was fed the enslaved Africans in the West Indies. And then finally, you had dun fish, or also known as broken fish, not fit for trade due to its high moisture content. This was fish that was consumed locally. Wonderful picture here. This is the fishing fleet in 1882 in Portland. And you know what's really cool is, you know, I live in Portland. I do walking tours in the old port. So I know exactly where this photograph is. This is the backside of Harbor Fish Market, where still today, the fishing boats come in right to this location and they unload their catches and it goes right into Harbor Fish Market, where their, you know, team of expert fish cutters process it. And so it looks very similar to what it looks like in this 1882 photograph. Of course, the boats today don't have masts or sails, but, you know, same process going on there. Very interesting stuff. Now, this is out on House Island, which is one of the islands in Casco Bay. In fact, right across from Willard Beach. This is what's known as a flake yard. So if you see, look at this picture, each one of these objects on these tables is an individual fillet of cod that's been salted and left out in the sun to cure. And like I said, it took about a week for that salt cod to cure. If it started to rain, it had to be covered up, taken out of the rain, and then put back out to cure as quickly as possible. But it gives you an idea of the scale of this industry, right? Once again, I'll quote from David Carey Jr. And he said, by the 1820s, Cuba had become the world's largest sugar producer, and most of it was going to the United States and England. Concurrently, Maine supplied Cuban planters with salt fish to feed their slaves, and Portland was Maine's fish export center. By selling the food that sustained them and consuming what they processed, Maine's major port became a primary beneficiary of Cuban slaves' labor. He goes on to say that Maine's historical relationship with slavery is complex. Its collaboration with Cuban slavery contradicts its stance against domestic slavery. And there I would disagree with David Carey Jr. because there were in Portland in 1836, and once again in 1847, two anti-abolition riots where people who were pro-slavery in Portland stopped abolitionist speakers from speaking at one time at the Quaker Meeting House, and another time at what is today the Unitarian Universalist Church, but at the time was a congregational church. And they threw rotten vegetables at these individuals and shouted them down. And one abolitionist speaker was beaten so badly on the steps of the congregational church that he was almost killed. And he spent a couple weeks recovering in Portland before he was able to continue his travels. So not entirely true what David Carey Jr. says about Mainers being opposed to slavery domestically. And in fact, here we are in Bath, and Bath, as you all know, was Cotton Town, right? It was known as Cotton Town due to its close economic relationship with the American South and the cotton that was produced there. So not all Mainers are opposed to the institution of African enslavement. Portland entrepreneurs, David Carey Jr. goes on to say, feasted on Cuban sugar, and this stood in stark contrast to Maine's abolitionist movement and the state's contribution to fight the South in the Civil War. So, once again, misconception. Oh, there was never African enslavement in Maine. That's not true. Slavery is legal here to 1783. Oh, we were all abolitionists. That's not true. People were staunchly for slavery here in Maine. We sent more troops to fight in the Civil War than any other state per capita. Well, that is, in fact, true. Paradoxically, Portlanders were structurally involved in slavery abroad, yet intolerant of it on their own soil. This cognitive dissonance, love that term, this cognitive dissonance. Well, what does that mean? It means they just didn't want to think about it, right? This cognitive dissonance reveals moral standards that were malleable in the face of profits and comforts. Once again, says David Carey Jr. in his essay, Comunidad Escondida, Latin American Influence in 19th and 20th century Portland. Once again, flake yard on House Island. And up until recently, I did not realize that these pictures were from House Island. I just found these. Actually, where I found these photographs once again was that book that I was telling you about, A Day's Work, about labor in Portland in the 1800s. So I was corrected. Another major contribution to the trade between Portland and the West Indies, lumber. Cuba's forests have been burned down to make room for sugar plantations, and hence Maine supplied much of the lumber for building, for example, the Port of Matanzas. Cuba, built almost entirely out of New England lumber. According to historian David Carey Jr., between 1856 and 1861, only 17 of the 1,040 lumber cargoes went to any other place than Cuba. Amazing. Only 17 cargoes of lumber out of over 1,000 went to any other place than Cuba. And from 1862 to 1864, about 1,000 vessels traveled from Maine ports to Cuba. End quote. Furthermore, Havana received large quantities of Maine ships' timbers in the 19th century to fuel their shipyards in Havana for building Spanish warships. So Spanish warships built by and large with Maine lumber. And so here you can see casks, and you can see a wooden sugar box. So molasses would have been shipped in casks, rum would have been shipped in casks, granulated sugar would have been shipped in wooden boxes. Here you see the streets of Trinidad, Cuba. As I mentioned, still lined with the ballast stones of Maine ships that traded there. And one of the things that I've been researching recently was the brick industry. And this is really interesting. A lot of brick production here in Maine. In fact, you could make bricks anywhere along the coast where you found a suitable deposit of clay. So, anywhere along the coast, up a river, on a stream, and you could just set up a brick kiln, just involved producing the bricks. You just needed some molds, and then you would fire the bricks for about a week, and they would go, change color to the red orange hue that we all recognize as bricks. But once again, they would use these bricks as ballast in the ships, and then they would sell them, once they got to the West Indies. In this case, these are ballast stones, which, as I said, still line the streets of Trinidad, Cuba today as a testament to this close economic relationship between Maine and the West Indies. Ice. Now, I can talk about the ice industry all day, but you didn't bring me here to do that. But suffice to say, the ice industry, fascinating, once again, related to the fact that, food is perishable and there's no electric refrigeration. First shipment of ice to the West Indies shipped from Bath in 1815. Harvested on the Kennebec River, stored in massive ice houses on the shore of the river. Perhaps some of you have seen a book out there called Tidewater Ice of the Kennebec. A fascinating book, but in that book, there's a map of all of the ice houses. There were 70 ice houses along the river. Not a single one remains today. You know what happens to big wooden structures? They burn to the ground, right? So my friend and I, my friend Matt, is a metal detecting enthusiast. We walked along the river where these ice houses used to be. We couldn't find a trace. The only thing you see is big, open, flat places of land where there used to be something, but not a trace of the industry. He couldn't find anything with his metal detector. So huge industry, right? I love it. They call it the harvest of diamonds. Harvest of diamonds. And all the unemployed farmers would walk to the river with their caulked boots in the winter to spend a couple months harvesting this ice. A lot of it shipped to the West Indies. After ice out, when rivers are free of ice in the spring, vessels would just sail right upriver and load their cargo. That's exactly what's happening in the photograph to the left there. The Consolidated Ice Company of Bodenham, for example, shipped ice to Cuba, Panama, and along the coast of South America. Ice was primarily used in the Caribbean to cool drinks and make ice cream at local cafes. Once again, here are all the different sizes of cask. Like I said before, a barrel is in fact the size of cask. So you can see starting with the firkin, a cute little firkin, all the way up to the tun. The tun is actually where we get the term tonnage from for ships. A ton is not a volume of weight when it comes to a ship. It's a measure of volume, and it's equivalent to 1,000 liters. So when we talk ship tonnage, it actually comes from this term tun. So there's something cool for your next cocktail party. So once again, I'll quote Rowe, who I started the presentation with, from his chapter on the West Indies trade. He said, many small sawmills were busy sawing and fitting the box boards to proper lengths, all ready to be set up and nailed on the sugar plantation. The cooper's trade in the manufacture of hogshead and tierce shooks. Once again, a shook is just the barrel once it's been broken down into its component parts to conserve space for shipping. So it would be broken down, all the staves would be numbered. It would have its hoops, which were by this time metal, and its headers, its top and its bottom, all broken down to be shipped to the West Indies. In 1867, listen to this, 263 such shops in the state, right? I call casks the ubiquitous shipping container of back in the day, because everything was shipped in casks historically. Dry goods, wet goods, apples, mackerel, rum, wine, beer, potatoes, everything shipped in casks. You had dry casks and wet casks. So you can see what a huge industry this is. 263 shops in the state. As it's been explained earlier in the book, shook was a package of red oak staves, headings, numbered to be ready to set up as a hogshead, tierce, or cask when needed. This was done by coopers on the plantations, once again, in places like Cuba and Jamaica, or by state of Maine coopers who went to the islands for that purpose. So you had coopers from Maine who would go down to the islands in their quiet time of year in the winter to assemble the casks down there. And my final slide, once again, quoting Rowe, then also there were house frames all ready to put up, oxen and horses for the plow, the sugar and the treadmill, farm produce such as parsnips, potatoes, onions and grain, beef, mutton, pork, pickled fish, soap, candles, and dried codfish in drums of from 500 to 800 pounds each. Lumber from the banks of Maine rivers, which cost there $8 a thousand, sold in Havana for 60. Beets and parsnips brought $16 a barrel on the French islands. And that's my presentation for you for this evening. I'd be happy to take any questions at this time. Thank you. Too kind. Yes, young lady.
I have several questions. Was most of the shipping between the West Indies and was it to Portland, or did any of it come to Bath directly?
I'm sure some of it came to Bath directly. Yep.
Okay. And did any of the enslaved people eventually settle in Maine?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. So you had so emancipation comes to Massachusetts province of Maine. And we'll all keep in mind that Maine doesn't become a state until 1820 as part of the Missouri Compromise. Up until that point, it's part of Massachusetts. So 1783 is when emancipation takes place in Massachusetts province of Maine, as in Massachusetts. But historians describe it as a gradual emancipation. And so not like the emancipation that took place in the American South in the wake of the American Civil War, or rather during the American Civil War. Oftentimes, enslavers would just not tell their enslaved Africans that emancipation had taken place. Or they would say something like, well, technically you're free, but you don't know anybody, you don't have anywhere to go. Build you a little shack in the backyard. You'll continue to work for me and I'll pay you a pittance. But yeah, you had, as you may know, communities formerly enslaved or the descendants of formerly enslaved. Petersboro, for example, had a large community of people of African heritage. And then, of course, we're all familiar with Malaga Island, where you had a community of mixed-race individuals, people descended from enslaved Africans, indigenous Americans, mixed-race individuals all living together until they were forcibly removed from the island, I think in 1911. So yeah, you have descendants of enslaved Africans who are free. And the interesting thing about that is, they're incredibly poor. These free individuals of African heritage. And we have in Portland, a community develops on Munjoy Hill, the Munjoy Hill neighborhood, where they eventually build the Abyssinian Meeting House, which is the United States' third oldest surviving African-American meeting house. And many of these individuals make their money as sailors or related maritime trades. It's almost like the Black Wall Street, of Maine, Munjoy Hill, because once again, these individuals by and large are very poor. Through working as sailors or blacksmiths or sailmakers, they're able to make enough money to buy houses, which, maybe it doesn't sound like a big deal today, but historically this was a huge deal for them. And so some of their other money, they went to sailors' benevolent societies or to build houses of worship like the Abyssinian Meeting House. Yeah, good question. Yes, sir.
This is a wonderful collection of all kinds of information pulled together in one place. Your focus is Portland, rather than, and there are so many interesting things that you could add to the collection as you move along the Maine coast.
Yeah. I'm
thinking of just small facts. You mentioned almost all the uses for barrels, and but you didn't mention lime.
Oh yeah,
which is a major
sure.
Major thing further east along the coast, and that whole business of reaction to slavery and the importance of the trade. You happen to know that Thomas Jefferson Southard launched a vessel for the cotton trade into the Kennebec in 1859. The vessel's name was Southern Rights.
Oh, how interesting!
And he figured that that would go down very well, and if a war did come, the raiders certainly would not burn a vessel named Southern Rights.
Wow, clever way to protect your investment. Yeah, no, I was unaware of that. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Sir, you had a question?
Can you talk a little bit more about that relationship with cotton?
Well, I honestly, that's not something that I have a lot of expertise on. I do know that they had an exhibit at the Bath, Maine Maritime Museum a couple of years ago, and the name of the exhibit was Bath Cotton Town. And so, people were structurally involved, in investing in voyages to the American South. And there was a special type of ship that they built right here in Bath that was a cotton vessel that had, a really big hull to accommodate as many cotton bales as possible. And those ships from right here in Bath would then sail down to Port like New Orleans, or, Charleston, would load the cotton, and then very often they would sail to England, where they had, in the early industrial era, textiles factories was one of the first industrial processes. And so just, I know that there was a special type of vessel that was built specifically for the cotton trade. And many of them were produced here in Bath. I mean, as much of the shipping in the United States was produced here in Maine, and Bath being one of the primary producers at that time, and that you had a lot of people who were invested in these cotton voyages, making substantial money from them, and that's why Bath was known as Cotton Town. But if you wanted to know more about this topic, I would encourage you to go to the Bath, Maine Maritime Museum right down the street. That exhibit is no longer up, but I have been in touch with the curatorial staff there recently, and they are going to curate a new exhibit that's going to continue some of the work and research of the Bath Cotton Town exhibit. So it's a little bit outside of my specific area of expertise, but just a little bit, yeah.
I was going to point out Baker's 2 volumes, Maritime History of Bath.
Yep.
Would provide a certain amount of that information.
Absolutely.
Everything else, and the ships in question, the matter of reading them as ships, a 3-masted vessel with square sails on all 3 masts. That was what Bath did in the 1850s. In the 1860s, it's interesting, as Baker points out, how quickly they shifted to schooners and went into coasting as the cotton trade pretty well dropped out of sight.
Yep.
In the 60s.
Yeah, and also the advent of steam, so now transatlantic voyages are steam vessels, but coasting vessels, particularly the big schooners, are still economically viable for a coastal trade, particularly with bulk goods like coal. So you see a lot of, like the Wyoming, for example, 6-masted schooner that was launched right here, involved in the coal industry. And I think that, they're still viable. They're being sunk by, German submarines during World War I. So there's these big schooners that you're talking about are still economically viable into the 1920s and hadn't been replaced by steam yet. Yeah, question back there.
Thank you. This is a wonderful talk. And I was just noticing, I was looking up Atlantic Black Box, and I noticed you gave a talk recently. I was going to ask if you knew about it.
Yeah, I'm happen to be I'm associated with the Atlantic Black Box. I'm a founding member, and the executive director, Dr. Meadow Dibble, and I shared a bus stop on Cape Cod in elementary school. So yeah, I was on the board up until recently, and I had to unfortunately step down due to time constraints, but still very much involved with the Atlantic Black Box. And I would encourage anybody who are interested in marginalized history, in New England's marginalized history, whether it has to do with African enslavement or indigenous history. Wonderful website that Dr. Dibble has put together with a great listing of resources, books, videos, and they host a monthly speaker series, and every month they bring in a speaker to talk on the topic of New England's marginalized history. So fabulous organization, and I would recommend to anybody out there, either in the audience or out in Zoom land, to check out their website. Yeah.
What was the name again?
The Atlantic Black Box Project.
I have a question.
Sure.
In your research, have you come across any information about enslaved Africans being traded on any of these boats?
Yeah, so you, well, not anything specific to Bath, but before you came in, I was discussing how enslaved Africans wound up in New England as a byproduct of this West Indies trade.
Right.
So a merchant would sail to the West Indies with a cargo of salt, cotton, lumber, purchase rum, sugar, and molasses, and then return with some enslaved Africans. And that's how, it was called the Second Middle Passage, how your enslaved Africans wound up here in New England largely.
I saw a talk by Dr. Dibble, and she had talked about that. We just moved up here from Cape Cod, so
where are you from?
We live in East Camp.
Get out of here. Yeah, Nassau Regional High School, 1992. Yeah.
We live about a block away from the
Wonderful. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I do a little work of this type in the south where I'm from,
Mhm.
near a plantation where I can't read enslaved.
Mhm.
And I do work with actually a descendant of one of the people enslaved there, several.
Mhm.
We do presentations in the south. I'm really interested in learning more about wherever I live, but this area.
Yeah.
And whatever I can hearing this.
Wonderful.
One other question, have you heard anything about the, the Underground Railway?
Yeah, I do quite a bit of research and related just usually pretty specifically to Portland. But it's a whole topic in of itself. I have a lecture that I do on Underground Railroad and abolition in Portland. And I had mentioned that you had in Portland this community of free individuals of African heritage, many of them working as sailors. They were instrumental to the Underground Railroad in Portland. Many of them operated businesses that were part of an Underground Railroad network. And so it's a fascinating topic, but really, deserves a lecture all its own. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, not at all. I can give you my email and we could get in touch. I'd be happy to present that information to you. Yeah.
There's going to be a lecture coming up on the Underground Railroad, which is with the Bath YMCA and the Bath Library.
Oh, cool.
It's interesting how all these.
Mm. Yeah. Jack, anything for me out there in Zoom land?
Those are the good questions have been technical questions.
Ah.
The one thing we got is that no one could hear the questions in the audience, so I've been typing away over here.
Gotcha.
Upcoming.
I know vaguely of it, but I don't know any more details. So I don't know if I did anything wrong. So.
Yeah, last question, and then I gotta get back to Portland before it starts snowing.
Comment is a hotel across the street, there used to be a distillery,
Yeah,
and I was wondering how long it took for a voyage for the ships to go in there.
yeah, great question. So they would typically sail, they would get 2 voyages in, and a voyage took a couple weeks each direction, and they would sail this, this would probably be the end of the time of year in which they would sail to the West Indies. They would sail in the late fall, winter, early spring. They're trying to avoid yellow fever in the summer and hurricane season. So they would have, used their boats for different purposes. Maybe they would make a trip to Newfoundland in the summer, something like that. But usually they would get 2 voyages in every winter. And like I said, took a couple weeks down there, a couple weeks back. So very good question. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, folks. Pleasure being here. I appreciate you having me. Lovely library that you have here in Bath. Yeah, maybe, have me back sometime. Yeah, thank you.
I can drop something on you.
Yeah.
The Cotton Town exhibit, one of the items